everyone. My name is Catherine, and I am an OpenSciEd high school teacher, facilitator, and writer. And in this video, we're going to talk about Lesson 9 of the P.1 electricity unit. Lesson 9 marks the first lesson of the second lesson set, where we seek to take lessons learned from what happened in Texas and apply them to improving our own community's electrical grid. So let's take a look at how we get here. If you recall, in lesson number 8, we figured out that the cause of the Texas energy crisis was really an imbalance of supply and demand, and that these power outages had an inequitable impact on people who already had existing disparities among their communities. And throughout Texas, the power companies didn't really think about who they were turning the power off on. Rather, they were trying to consider the types of buildings in different neighborhoods and communities and trying to keep the power on at an essential building. So in this lesson, we're wondering what design solutions could have prevented this, as the podcast in lesson 8 did mention that there were several. And so we're trying to figure out how could we prevent a crisis like this, not just in Texas, but also in our own community. So let's take a look at lesson 9 here at a glance. This is a 2-day investigation routine lesson. And there aren't any hands-on wet labs and no additional prep for you other than your typical slides and copy making routine. And within the 2 days of lesson 9 here, there are 2 key sense-making opportunities. So let's dive into those further. In the first key sense-making opportunity for students here in day 1, we are trying to figure out how a battery would actually improve the reliability of an electrical grid system. As again, this was one of the potential solutions that we heard in the podcast with an energy expert back in lesson 8. And so we realized when we add battery storage to a grid, we can make it more reliable because that battery can supply some of the extra energy that we may need in a situation where supply drops. And so after doing this, we take a look at what are some real battery storage solutions, like what do these things actually look like? And we take that information into day 2 and our second key sense-making opportunity, where we actually carry out some calculations to figure out how many energy storage solution types would be needed to have prevented what happened in Texas, and determine which of those seem to be most feasible based upon the needs of a particular community in Texas. So through this, we figure out that design solutions that store excess energy, like batteries, can prevent an energy crisis because they bridge that gap between demand and supply when supply drops. And that we also realize that all forms of energy production, as well as this energy storage, and the resource extraction needed for some of these energy storage solutions have benefits as well as costs. So let's dive into these key moments a little bit further. So the first one, again, comes in day 1, where students are trying to think through an energy storage solution using our energy transfer diagram models. And this image is from the teacher guide with, or the key, which is a teacher resource in the folder. And it gives you the example of adding batteries to a solar cell system. However, this does not have to be the grid or the system that your students think through. Essentially, what they want to do is consider one model before supply drops and a second model after supply drops when a battery is present. So in their first model, they should be showing extra energy going into the battery, and in that second model, showing energy coming out of that battery to bridge that gap. What's key here, again, for students is the direction of the energy transfer with their arrows, They need that nonlinear to and from the battery in these different situations. And where they place the battery can depend on what that direction looks like. And we want students here, again, to be quantifying energy in the system to support this claim of reliability. So whatever mechanisms you've been or systems that you've been using in your class to do these energy transfer models, we want to see that thinking here as students work through this for the first time. So from here, we then look at a real energy storage solution. And students are introduced to the Moss Landing Energy Storage Facility in California and how much energy that facility can hold. And then we revisit these electricity production graphs from lesson 3 to try to figure out what is the gap between energy supply and demand. And we use that calculation to figure out how many Moss Landing systems would have been needed to prevent this entire crisis in Texas. So then we come back the next day and we say, okay, well, yesterday we figured out that we would need a certain amount of these systems to prevent the crisis. So if it's possible, then why didn't we already have them in place? Well, cost is a very common constraint. And so we get information about how much one of these systems costs. And we use that to figure out, well, what would be the overall cost for all of Texas? And what would this look like per resident? And we figure out that this is quite a costly design solution. So from here, we look at what are some other possible energy storage solutions. And we apply the calculations that we did earlier in part 6 as a class to, on our own or with our partner, see if there are any other storage solutions that might be more feasible than the Moss Landing solution. And this is an opportunity for you to identify students who might need some additional support in these types of calculations before they get to that final transfer task in lesson 11. So you want to note that here. So after lesson number 9 here, we figure out that a battery storage, again, can increase the reliability, but it has a really high financial cost. And we wonder, are there other non-financial costs? So as home learning, we read about some additional non-financial costs and trade-offs of chemical batteries and the extraction of resources needed for them. And we use that information to update our engineering design tracker. So let's look at some material management tips and tricks here for lesson number 9. First one that I have for you is to think of this math as unit conversion or dimensional analysis and present it to students as such. And if you are finding that students will need additional practice opportunities as they do see these types of calculations again in lesson 11, I encourage you to provide those opportunities in context, meaning we are giving students a reason to try to go through some additional calculations and practice. And perhaps you use that handout that's already provided in this lesson to create one that might be localized for your community so that we're doing this math for a reason. And just to note that when we are trying to figure out the gap between energy supply and demand in all of Texas, we are using an average energy and supply demand gap rather than the actual. It's just something to note. Depending on the inquisitiveness of your students, they may note that as well. We're estimating it is 20,000 megawatts per hour of energy needed to bridge that gap, but the maximum amount actually needed would be closer to 25,000. So just note that. And then lastly, the home learning reading where we look at additional trade-offs of chemical batteries is super important because you're going to need that information in the next lesson. So do not skip that. Again, if home learning does not work in your context, then make time for it in class. In terms of personal glossary, we co-construct and add together this term storage solution to our glossaries, where we really figure this out through the mathematical calculations we do. And then words that we encounter but we don't need to add to our glossary are terms like pumped hydropower or flywheel, which again come up as we investigate and calculate other energy design storage solutions. And then there aren't additional posters that we make and need to manage in this lesson, but we do go back to these graphs from lesson 3, so it might be handy to have students pull those out. And we will update our engineering design tracker and continue to use it in the next lesson. Thank you for joining me to hear more about lesson 9, and I hope we're starting to get ideas about how we could try to localize this idea of an energy crisis and how to prevent it for our own community. And I hope you join me in the next video for lesson 10, where we look about how do we actually take these trade-offs that we've identified and use them to make decisions. See you then.